College football nerds here talking playoff picture. It's still kind of cloudy, but it's an interesting discussion. So I'm going to have that discussion with my main nerd, Josh. We're going to get nerdy with y'all. We're going to talk a lot of scenarios in this one. Please please subscribe. I know you want to. You've been thinking about it. Just go ahead and do it. You might be mad that we're not doing a preview this week, but y'all, the only game we considered was Washington, Oregon State, and we just ran out of time. We wouldn't do any kind of numbers on that one. And we think this is a little more interesting conversation, though it is interesting to note that Oregon State is favored in that game. All right, Josh, so I want to say that by this time in the year, the playoff picture is a little more clear than it is right now. There is an interesting scenario where the SEC champion might get left out that we're going to get to in a minute. But first, let's talk Big Ten. I'm a little frustrated because we really don't know much about the Big Ten because Michigan didn't play anybody out of conference, because West Virginia isn't good, and because Ohio State really struggled with a Notre Dame team that I think is good, not great. We don't have a clear picture on the Big Ten. Yes, you can beat the crap out of all the UNLVs and Bowling Greens in the world and look great in an eye test all you want. But the fact of the matter is Michigan didn't play a ranked team or really a top 40 quality team until November 11th. And they were ahead 17-9 with 4.5 minutes left to go in the game. To me, I think that clearly the winner of Michigan Ohio State belongs in the playoffs, assuming they win the championship game. But also, to me, I have a little less comfort in thinking that Michigan is, as of a week or two ago, was number one in everybody's mind. I'm not sure that they're in the top. I'm not sure the winner of that game is in the top two teams in the country. I know people are going to be mad about that, but that's just my feeling on how the Big Ten's playing right now.
We often say that your ability to dominate bad competition is an important indicator of quality, and it is. I do think, though, it's important to kind of keep in mind when we say bad teams, what we mean by that, and just how relative it can get, right? You know, Kentucky's the 34th best team in the country, and something Georgia did earlier in the year and something Alabama just did is they just pummeled a team that's 34th in the country. I wouldn't call Kentucky a bad team. They're more of an average team, I think, by P5 standards. But the point I'm making here is when we say average and bad, I'd almost say bad starts at like 50th, because half of college football is almost irrelevant. They're Power 5 conferences, about 12 to 14 teams each. You only have roughly about 60 teams in P5. There are about 75 teams that are outside that world, the majority of which are uncompetitive out of conference games. And frankly, that's all Michigan played out of conference. And you can't take anything from it, because those are teams that, you know, Tennessee throttled Virginia to start the year. That doesn't mean a whole lot. You're going to see those teams just wallop those lower level competition teams about any time they want to. Sometimes, yeah, there's hiccups and there's bad signs from that. But a lot of times it's just a matter of, hey, have we figured out how to play football yet, or are we screwing around or what? You can beat the crap out of those teams anytime you want to. We're usually talking about teams more in the like 35 to 65 range, which is only a handful of G5 teams, actually. Sort of some of the upper level teams in the G5. It's more about the mid to bottom of your own conference. And in that respect, I think Michigan's played well. But I don't know how much to take from it. And an interesting anecdote here, when we do our model and we run this new 1 through 133 power rating, which you can go to collegefootballnerds.com and you can look at yourself. You can also model any two teams against each other, which is the basis for it. It takes every team and then it models them against every other team in the country, comes up with a win probability for each game, right? How likely you are to win. And then based on that comes up with your projected record. So, you know, it may say that in Michigan's case, they're expected to lose 3.8 games. Doesn't mean there's actually 3.8 teams ranked ahead of them. It just means in some, if you play all the rest of them, somewhere along the way you'd find 3.8 losses. I think that's probably a little over-aggressive, though. And one of the more notable points here is Georgia and Ohio State are pretty close, around 7 losses each. Ohio State's 4th right now in that ranking, but only after we do conference adjustments. So we run a whole series of these based on our historical data to say, okay, using the model and based off what actually happened, how did the results pan out of conference, right? Is the model overestimating or underestimating results if, say, this conference USC team plays an SEC team? And then we do a lot of work behind the scenes iteratively to sort of retrain the model a little bit and say, no, when team from this conference plays a team from this other conference, the stats aren't quite the same, right? Because we have all these relative performance stats and all these other things. Well, you start more and more as the season goes along. And it's kind of funny. It actually gets more important as the season goes along because your stats become more dominated by in-conference play. Those statistics don't necessarily reflect... they reflect how you're doing against your own conference, not necessarily how you do against everybody else. And in that regard, it actually... Currently, the SEC is viewed better than the Big Ten. Georgia hops over Ohio State. They're third in our power rating because of the conference offsets. And I think there's this view from the very beginning of the season that the SEC is down, the Big Ten is up, the Pac-12 is way up. I don't know, we've talked about this for a few weeks now, that actually pans out in truth. Daniel, I'll let you talk about it in a second if you want to get your stuff together, some sort of stats on the Big Ten side. But I'll talk about it from like the Pac-12 perspective, the SEC perspective. People took a lot from Utah beating Florida 24-11. Well, that Florida team is now 5-5, and Florida LSU just played Florida, beat their ever-loving brains out. Utah had 270 yards of offense in that game. LSU just put up 700 on Florida. It turns out Florida's a bad football team. Georgia drug them up and down the field too. So a lot of these out-of-conference data points that we thought meant something, like Florida State blowing out LSU. Well, Florida State is the class of the ACC. LSU is now 3, maybe 4-loss team in the SEC. Those aren't equivalent things. We just had the LSU really way overranked. A lot of people had them ahead of Alabama. That was a serious mistake, and that informed judgment. We also throw out things like Mississippi State beat Arizona. Yeah, the Mississippi State team that LSU just beat 51-10 beat Arizona this year. But Arizona was just ranked, which is, in my opinion, kind of dumb. A lot of people don't know or realize that Missouri beat Kansas State this year, which was viewed as a nothing game and a throwaway game. Well, it turns out Kansas State's one of the best teams in the Big 12. Missouri has been one of the better teams in the SEC, but I don't think they're viewed as one of the best ones. But they beat Kansas State on the field. So I think there's a lot of bad perceptions based off games that we thought were or were not important to start the season. And as it turns out, when you really flesh it out on the Big Ten side, frankly, the out-of-conference play hasn't necessarily held up. The quality of competition hasn't held up. The performances haven't held up. And it starts to bring up a lot more questions in terms of relational strength from the Big Ten and everyone else. Again, not saying Michigan or Ohio State are bad teams at all, because they have largely dominated competition outside Notre Dame game being a big exception. But it does start to raise the question of, okay, so what, right? Have you played anybody? And I'm not sure the answer is that they really have.
It's going to be interesting to see how you take all of what you just said and then erase it when we talk about how Alabama belongs in the playoffs if they went out over Texas. We'll get there. For me, it really boils down to how elite are the Big Ten defenses. Because if they are elite, it really stunts what you might think about a particular offense. For example, if Ohio State played LSU and beat them 31-10 or 24-10, that completely changes what I think about how hard it would be to score on that defense for any team. And then it really doesn't matter how good your offense is because you're going to have a close game either way. That's the thing I don't know about because the Big Ten offenses suck. And look, I don't think Michigan's offense sucks, but after Saturday and after seeing them struggle a little bit against Rutgers, I don't think they're an elite offense. Like, they're not LSU, they're not Georgia. Now, they definitely have a better defense than LSU. They might have a better defense than Georgia. So in the long run, it might not matter. But based on what we know, like, I think it's clear at this point that Penn State has a bad offense this year. A lot of the numbers against them are a product of that bad offense. I still think they have a good defense, but they've played other bad offenses. That's where I just have a hard time when everybody kind of circles the wagons and goes back in conference. How do you know what you're looking at because you don't know if they're good or not? This doesn't need to be a beat up on the Big Ten thing because I think that all that plays out. Michigan beats Ohio State. Ohio State beats Michigan. Whoever wins that game deserves to be in the playoffs. And I don't care about the cheating stuff. Like, if Michigan wins out this season, it's a 1.5 game season for them anyway. And obviously, they're not going to be doing a bunch of sign stealing stuff against Ohio State. So, and I don't think they needed it against Rutgers or UNLV. So, to me, their season is legitimate. If they win out and win a national championship, I think it's legitimate. So whoever wins that game belongs in the playoffs. The rest of the field, it's kind of a question for me. You talk about the Pac-12, Josh. The three best teams in the Pac-12 right now, Oregon State, Washington, and Oregon, collectively out of conference have played 0 Power 5 teams, Oregon State, an 8-point win over Texas Tech, and a win over Michigan State. How do we know how good the Pac-12 is, and doesn't it kind of matter when we talk about the potential of, and we'll just break down the numbers, then I'll ask you the question, if Michigan or Ohio State is going to be in the playoffs, if Oregon beats Washington or Washington wins out, if Texas wins out, if FSU wins out, and if Alabama beats Georgia, one of those teams, one of those conference champions has to get left out. Let's start with the Pac-12. Pac-12 versus, let's say Alabama wins out. Because if Georgia wins out, they're in. But let's say Alabama beats Georgia. How do you make an argument that even an undefeated Washington deserves it more than Alabama, who will have the toughest strength of schedule of any team in consideration for the playoffs?
I think if Washington has a loss, it gets tough, right? Because you look at some of Alabama's rougher games early on in the season. Obviously, they have a loss, but they're lost to Texas as a top 10 team. And then beyond that, 8-point win over Arizona State ain't moving the needle much. Southern Cal games 52-42. I guess that's good. Utah games a 1-score win. Utah jumped on them early, and then Washington kind of put them away late. But again, I don't know how good Utah really is, right? In our rankings, Utah is 30th. UCLA is 26th. There's only there's 4 Pac-12 teams in the top 25. Arizona's 22nd in our metrics. USC's floating around 16th, obviously a one-dimensional team. And then you have Washington at 7. You have Oregon at 2. The problem you start running into is when you compare Alabama and Oregon, and I tweeted about this a few weeks ago. The resume is really disparate, right? Because Alabama at this point has played like 7 top 40 teams. I think Oregon's played 3, and it's a loss, a close win, and a big win, and that's it. And the resume is just absolutely stacking up because Alabama at this point is going to have 2 or 3 times as many difficult games as Oregon has, and only have 1 loss out of it. Against a team in Texas that, especially at that point in the year, I don't think was any worse than Washington. In our metrics, Washington 7, Texas is 8, so it's kind of hard to draw a party foul there. But in terms of quality of wins, Alabama's way ahead. I mean, LSU's 9th in our metrics. There's several top 25 teams in our metrics that Alabama's beaten. At that point, they'll beaten Georgia if they were to make the playoff. Georgia... there's only the 2 biggest wins you could possibly have would be beating Georgia or beating Michigan, which Ohio State and Alabama have. So you put that feather in the cap, which I think is a lot bigger than beating Washington, and I don't know how you can put Oregon ahead. I don't know why you would. I know Oregon has been pretty dominant, but again, they've been dominant against teams that have not been top 50, top 60 teams, and that's not a big deal. Alabama has generally been dominant against teams like that too. Except one game aside against South Florida where they didn't play their starting quarterback and it was a bit of a rainstorm. They still won that game. Still won it at the end of the day, kind of put it away. Defense didn't let South Florida do anything, whatever. It was a bad game, but it was also an obviously weird one. Outside that, they've played at a high level and they've beaten a lot of really good teams by good margins. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a weird year. I think the conference that's floating around, I think, that gets ignored a lot is the Big 12 because they have a lot of teams that have been pretty high level teams. There's a lot of, Kansas State floating up there pretty good. You've got Texas, you've got Oklahoma. There's depth to that conference, I think, that's underappreciated. Kansas has been a good team. Iowa State's been a good team. And, yeah, this is the thing that's jarring to me, Daniel, right? Out of conference, go back to the Big Ten and look. Hopefully you already liked and subscribed. I've made most of the Michigan fans angry. And if you're an Ohio State fan, at least maybe like and subscribe because of that. Just saying what I think is true. The Big Ten's out-of-conference record versus P5 is currently 6 of 8. You noted 11 of 14 games they've played out of conference. They've scored less than the opponent allows on average. So there's a lot of reason to think the offenses aren't pretty good. That drives down our metrics to the point where you start talking top 36, right? You get Michigan 1, you have Ohio State 4. You start looking down this list for the next Big Ten team, and for us right now, it's Penn State at 18. And now they were a top 5 team a few weeks ago, and they're now 18th. You look further, and this is where it gets jarring to me, Nebraska is the next one on the list at 36th. So when you talk resumes, the resume of a team coming out of the Big 12, the resumes of the team coming out of the SEC, I'd probably even say the resumes maybe even of a team coming out of the ACC, which has a lot of teams in the top 25, top 30 in these rankings, is going to be a lot more accomplished. They're going to play a lot more top 35 teams because the reality is, more so than I think was initially anticipated, the Pac-12 is kind of top-heavy. The Big Ten is extremely top-heavy. Now, Michigan and Ohio State have been the class of it. I have no problem with one of them making the playoff. Do not take it that way. But you have to acknowledge that it's a very top-heavy conference this year. It is not particularly good top to bottom. And so the resume question, I think, for maybe the Big 12 and the SEC in particular gets iffy because I could see one of those two conferences getting left out just because they beat themselves up in a way that the other conferences didn't have the opportunity to do. And it's a little unfair because, as your point being, if Washington, let's say Washington goes undefeated, Texas wins out, let's say Michigan wins out, and Florida State wins out, you get 3 undefeated teams, and your 4th team is a Texas team that beat Alabama at home, and they're going to end the season with a win over Oklahoma. I don't know how you can include Alabama. I don't think there's any way the pollsters are going to. Texas and Alabama having the same record, and Texas having the head-to-head. But the difficult thing, Georgia, and by the way, I'm not saying Georgia because if Georgia goes undefeated, they're going to be in over Texas, and you've got 4 undefeated, and it's all nice and clean. But Alabama, to me, really screws with a lot of this because if they were to play today, one, I think Alabama would be favored over basically everybody but maybe Michigan or Ohio State. I think they would be favored over Texas in a rematch today, maybe by a considerable margin. I think what they've done from a resume perspective has been better than almost anybody else other than the undefeateds, only because we view losses as being bad, rightly or wrongly, given depth of schedule. And they're just a different team than they were in week 2. They've improved tremendously. A lot of teams have either not improved that much or maybe have regressed. And I don't think anybody wants to play them right now. And, we're big ones to say the whole season matters, and it certainly does, and I'm not taking away from that, but I'm saying what they've accomplished over the course of the season has just built and built and built and built from where they were in week 2 by adding more and more, pelts to their waistband or what have you. I don't know, kind of out of speed on my frontier metaphors. But I don't know what other teams have. So I feel like it's kind of a weird rant, but it's a weird, frustrating year for me because I think we've really concluded the SEC's down, maybe the Big 12's down, etc. And we're wanting to rank based on that. But the reality, when you start digging into where teams actually are, don't support it. And I think there's a really good chance this year that we're going to have a playoff filled with some teams that have very high rankings, but maybe don't have the quality to support those rankings and maybe have more of a disconcerting year than maybe we've ever had in terms of not having the best teams, quality teams in the playoff when all is said and done.
Yeah, and usually something happens down the stretch that makes it a little cleaner, and I anticipate that's probably going to happen here. But it would be wild to me if Alabama goes undefeated in the SEC, beats what I currently have as the number 1 team in the country. So they beat the best team in the country. at that point, if Alabama runs the table post Texas, beats Georgia, they would be a favorite over every team in the country on a neutral site. Do you agree with that?
I think that's likely true.
And you have like Texas, who since beating Alabama, in 4 of their last 5 games, they've either lost or beaten an unranked team by 1 score. Now, beyond that, Alabama would have a better resume, in my opinion, than Florida State, than anybody in the Pac-12, than honestly anybody except a Michigan or Ohio State. But even that is debatable, because Michigan, while Alabama was playing Texas, Michigan was playing a G5 team that they scheduled in lieu of playing a game against UCLA. And so that's the frustrating thing to me, because what it does is the committee literally says to Alabama and Texas, because they're the ones that will be in the bubble, don't schedule that game.
Let me put it this way, okay? If they run the table, Alabama will have beaten 7 top 35 teams, or will have played 7 top 35 teams and gone 6-1. Michigan will have played 2 in our power rating.
Right.
Is 6-1 really worse than 2-0? That becomes your question, because again, when you get outside the top 35, we quickly start dealing with teams that are of no actual threat to being an elite. And that's literally Michigan's entire schedule. I hate to say it, but it is.
You know the great irony here, Josh, is in the last year of the 14 playoff, it would be the 1 year, well, it's worked before, but it would be the most shining example of why we on this channel and Josh Pate on his have been warning people why you don't want to expand the playoffs, because all you do is let Alabama in. The best way to get a championship that's not in the SEC is to, in my opinion, people might get mad about this, is to exclude in some way the best team from the SEC. That's your best shot at winning a title. And look, the playoff proves that. The BCS proved that. It's like the best shot you have at a championship is to make sure that the hot SEC team or the best SEC team somehow trips up and gets a gotcha loss along the way and doesn't have to play, because you give them a month of rest. You don't want to play them. So what we've done is we've cried when the best team from the SEC gets in the playoff, or that the 2 best teams in the country are from the SEC. We've cried that it's unfair that they make the playoffs, so we say we have to expand it, because then we'll show them that they didn't belong there. Well, all you're doing is you're taking 2023 Alabama, who wouldn't be in the playoffs, will be playing in some New Year's Six Bowl, and instead you have to play them. So instead of playing, I don't know, Texas or Florida State in your opening round, you're playing Alabama. And nobody wants that. Nobody wants to admit it, but they don't want that. And so what happens? This year, Alabama beats Georgia, but gets left out because they lost to Texas, which means the regular season super mattered, right? That also eliminates Georgia from the playoffs. So instead, in the 12-team playoff, you got Alabama and Georgia. Nobody wants that, but that's what we're going to get. You're welcome. This is what happened from all the crying. What do you think, Josh?
No, you obviously know I agree with you on this. The reality of an expanded playoff is you're going to make it more and more likely that the highest quality team wins more than the most accomplished team. That should be the obvious thing that people don't want to accept, and I think people don't want to accept it because they don't want to accept the reality that their team may not be the most talented roster, that they may not be the best overall quality team, right? Best conference. You're a team that went on a magical run. Like you're Michigan State in 2015. 2015 Michigan State is never going to win a playoff or get anywhere close to it. Okay? They had a special season. They accomplished a lot. They got to the playoffs. They looked completely and utterly out of place. And that's what we're going to see. You know, TCU did all that, got to play Michigan, won that game. Maybe reasons for that, maybe not. They played Georgia. That was the most laughable thing imaginable because it was clear from the opening snap of that game that TCU did not deserve to be on the same field as Georgia. And, people, I think to this point, people have sort of said, well, but they beat Michigan, so maybe that means something. Look, there's enough reason at least for you to say, okay, maybe there was something specific about that Michigan game. It was the only reason TCU won. And if you take that and you accept it and you move on, then you start to draw the conclusion of, in an expanded playoff, I don't think TCU had a great chance of beating LSU or beating Alabama or one of these second, third, fourth best teams in like the SEC. They're going to get knocked off immediately. And so I think you end up with a reality where you're going to have Final Four with Ohio State and 3 SEC teams. And is that really what people want to see? And then Ohio State gets knocked off and you see an SEC rematch in the national championship? Because you're going to see rematches in the national championship, probably with some frequency in this new format. We have advocated on our channel for a 16 playoff because I think 6th is the number that was needed for access, because it's this year maybe that scenario, right? Where let's say Alabama wins the SEC, you can end up in a scenario where this one conference team that has one loss gets knocked out because the other conferences go undefeated with weak schedules, or a top G5 team just doesn't have a slot to be able to get in. You go to 6, you fix the access problem. But when you go to 8 and you go to 10 and you look at it historically, the rate at which you're going to let in 3-loss teams, the rate at which you're going to let in teams that have already really proven that by losing their conference that they don't deserve a shot, that have lost 2 games, they've lost the silly game, they should be out of it, it starts to go up dramatically. And the rate of mulligans for the Alabamas of the world go up dramatically. And the thing that nobody ever wants to admit in this discussion is when we get there, we're going to lose to them. Because what we always hear is, like Iowa fans are big, have been big in this for some reason. Oh, if we just get access to the playoff, if our teams that keep losing in the conference championship game, if they just made it to the playoff, well, then our recruiting would spike because we're a playoff team. It's like, did it really help Washington when they played Alabama in 2016 and got drugged? Did it help Cincinnati when they got drugged in the playoffs? Did it help anybody? Michigan State when they got drugged in the playoffs? I don't think it helps your team to make the playoffs and lose 50-10. I really don't. I think it does you a lot better when you're UCF and you go to a bowl playing against the third best team in Auburn that's missing their star running back in Kerryon Johnson, and you win a close game against an unmotivated team, and everybody says, oh man, they could have done great in the playoffs. That helps your program because now you've got a little bit of edge, and people say, oh, we go here, we can go anywhere. We can build UCF into a playoff team. That aspirational hope, that lack of knowledge went a long way. Because if UCF played a motivated Georgia or Alabama in 2017, they were getting rocked. It's just what was going to happen. And the thing is, they were a top 8 team. So in this new format, you're going to find out. Mess around, find out.
TCU is 33rd. TCU is currently 33rd in recruiting rankings.
Yeah, that's exactly where you expect them to be, right? Well,
right.
That and TCU is also, I think at this point, I haven't really heard this metric go out because mainstream media doesn't really love to be negged. TCU is probably the worst national champion participant in the following year in a long time. I'd be curious. This is a stat we need to dig up. It's got to be
the last
decades.
one with a losing record. Was Texas in 2010. So it's been 13 years since that happened, but they were still competitive. They just weren't very good. I think they were like 5-7, 6-6, something like that. This happened last year. Alabama was kept out. They were playing pretty good football towards the end of the year. They got left out, and they absolutely annihilated the team that beat TCU in the conference championship game. They destroyed Kansas State. That game was uncompetitive. But that meant the system worked. Alabama didn't belong in the playoffs last year, but they were a national championship caliber team in some phase, right? But we don't want them to get to lose a couple of games, to lose to Tennessee, to lose to LSU, and then still make the playoffs because that means those games meant so little, right? That becomes an NFL where you can go 8-8 and still make the playoffs. and we don't want that. Last thing before we close out, Josh, there is an interesting postseason scenario for college football, assuming they all play. If Georgia wins out, then that's Alabama's the highest rated SEC team that doesn't go to the playoffs. They get a New Year's Six bowl. And they would likely kick out the Big 12 champion because there's no head-to-head to worry about, which would very likely be Texas. Who has the Sugar Bowl tie-in, Big 12 and SEC? That means we would see an Alabama and Texas rematch, which would be super interesting. Probably the most interesting scenario for either fan base if they didn't get to go to the playoffs.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I'll say, haven't thought extensively on handicapping it, but right now, knowing where those two teams are, and the injury situation with Ewers definitely factors into some extent. I think Alabama would be a 10-point favorite or more over Texas. And that's with our model right now. I just ran it. It'd be 26-20 Texas favored. But that is an indication of really how different Alabama's been the last 3 or 4 weeks. Offensively, look, it's not a schedule thing. Kentucky proved it because that's a pretty good defense that Kentucky has this year. Their offense is pretty terrible. The defense is good. And Alabama about ran them out of the stadium by the second quarter. Absent a muff punt, that game was going to be 31-0.
Well, it was just 21-0 with 5 minutes left in the first quarter.
Yeah, that was brutal. Alabama wasn't doing that. I mean, South Florida is not anywhere near as good as Kentucky, and they couldn't move the ball early in the season. Alabama's become a different animal, and I think if they played Texas again in a rematch, even knowing Texas won the first game, Alabama would be favored by 10 or more. I really do think that'd probably be the case. Nobody wants to play them right now. I'm sure Georgia doesn't want to play them, but they're going to have to. And I'll say this, Daniel.
I think I saw an early spread for Georgia Alabama, and Georgia was only favored by 4.
The winner of the Georgia Alabama game, I'll go ahead and say, is going to be favored on every remaining game they play. Assuming if they lose the first game, they'll lose being favored. If they win the first game, they'll be favored in the second. The winner of the Georgia Alabama game is going to be favored over every single game. And to that point, FanDuel just put out national championship odds, and I found it pretty fascinating because it had Michigan at plus 220, Georgia's at plus 250, Alabama's at plus 700, Ohio State's at plus 850, then Florida State at 900, Oregon at 900, Washington at 1,200, Texas at 2,000. The notable thing to me is that Georgia and Alabama are back-to-back at 250 and 700, and that Georgia's right behind Michigan at 250 to 220. And that the key there is knowing that if Alabama beats Georgia, it's very hard for Georgia to make the playoff. So that's really Vegas saying they actually think Georgia is the best team. Their odds are only slightly lower because there's a higher chance that they get knocked out in the conference championship game. And again, Alabama's odds are better than Ohio State's to win the national title. And that's sort of reflecting the fact that even though they're the second and number 3 teams, they're sandwiched in there between Michigan and Ohio State. And so it's sort of easy to say, well, maybe Michigan or Ohio State is the bigger favorite. But if you put it together, right, if you want to say combined odds, right, if you're to bet on both of them, it'd be betting plus 950 on the SEC teams. It'd be betting plus 1070 on the Big Ten teams. So there's no doubt from Vegas's mind, if you think of it that way, you hedge and you bet on both. Vegas is saying it is more likely than not that the SEC champion is going to win the national title this year. And what I find particularly kind of fascinating is how far back a lot of the other teams are, right? That undefeated at Florida State is all the way back at plus 900. Oregon's at plus 900. Washington's all the way back at 1,200. So they're saying it's something like 6 times more likely that Georgia wins the title than Washington. But even with the specter of everything else going on, that Alabama has a considerable advantage in the odds over Florida State, Oregon, Washington, I think is extremely telling to this point. And again, it's also just utterly fascinating that Texas is all the way back at plus 2,000, sitting there with 1 loss, ability to win the Big 12, make the playoff, everything's in front of them. And Vegas doesn't even seem to give them a chance relative to the rest of the field. And that, again, should show you how much Alabama's improved and how scary the SEC champions are relative to everyone. And again, seems like, I'm sure you feel like we've been really negative with the Big Ten. we've been maybe negative to the conference, but I want to be clear that doesn't really apply to Michigan and Ohio State. They're up there with Georgia and Alabama. Our point is they're in isolation way better than the rest of the conference, and we think they project at Georgia, Alabama. Georgia, Alabama are more proven based on the overall quality of the conference and depth. And as it's gone along, Vegas odds makers are telling you, look, the SEC's just, I think, based on this, is just deeper than the other conferences. They don't buy necessarily into the general media perspectives. When you look at the AP poll, and the only two teams they think they can challenge them are Michigan and Ohio State, that are just leaps and bounds better than the rest of the Big Ten.
Yeah, I think that's, we said this for years with Clemson, right? Like, you can be an elite team in a bad conference. So, all right, y'all, let us know what you think about the playoff situation that's currently cloudy and whether or not it's going to work itself out, or if one of these conference champions is going to have to be maybe unfairly left out. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.